At first, it just seemed like they were, just not interested in dinner. Adolphus would go up to the bedroom and he'd knock on the door and it would open a crack and both Bobby and Betty's faces would come to the door at the same time. And Adolphus would say, hey, dinner's on the table. Do you want to come down to eat? And the girls, without even looking at each other, would say in perfect unison, we're not hungry. And then they would shut the door. And it was like, okay, I guess they just don't want to eat. But then weeks would go by and the girls would just refuse to come out and eat. And so the girls began to lose a considerable amount of weight, like an unhealthy amount of weight. But no matter what Adolphus and his wife did, they just would not eat. And so after a couple of weeks of this, Adolphus and his wife decided that, they clearly were not going to get through to their daughters and get them to change their behavior just by presenting them with logic. Hey, you really ought to come down here and eat because you have to eat to survive. Like, they're not listening to that. There's something going on here. And it seemed increasingly obvious that it was mental, that these girls were really struggling with some sort of mental illness. At least that was the parents' suggestion. And so they brought their daughters to go see a psychiatrist. And the psychiatrist very quickly actually made a diagnosis. They said that Bobby and Betty both had schizophrenia, which is a very serious chronic brain condition that affects the way you think, the way you behave. Basically all the ways in which you interact with the world can be gravely affected by schizophrenia. And so a lot of their strange behaviors or their anomalous behaviors, in particular, their not eating and their codependency, the psychiatrist believed could basically be explained by schizophrenia. And so ultimately, the psychiatrist prescribed Bobby and Betty some antipsychotic medication and promised Adolphus that if they take these meds, they'd be okay. But even though Adolphus and his wife ensured that Bobby and Betty took their medication exactly as they were supposed to every single day, the twins did not seem to get any better. If anything, they actually continued to get worse. They spent, if anything, more time, locked in their bedroom, and they became more frail, and they continued to barely eat, and they also began showing signs of being very paranoid around anybody that was not their other sibling, even their own parents. It was like the only person either Bobby and Betty could be around was the other. They couldn't be around anybody else. They just kind of hid themselves away, basically 24/7. And so pretty quickly, Adolphus came to the realization that these antipsychotic meds are not doing enough, or maybe they're not doing anything at all.